Welcome everybody to the session 3, developing your sustainability narrative, part of the ESG Demystified training series. My name is Dominic Brindley, head of public sector here at NatWest. Today we're going to hear from Caroline Haas, who's the head of sustainable finance for financial institutions and SSAs, and from Varun Sada, head of ESG advisory, specifically around the topic of helping you think about developing your sustainability narrative. If you can move to the next slide, please. As noted, in terms of the series, it's been developed so it can be accessible for treasury and finance staff, get taught by a range of NatWest experts focusing on ESG aspects that are most relevant for the public sector. As with all things, we'd welcome your feedback around the curriculum and what's been presented thus far. And if there's anything that you would like to see in future webinars, then please do let us know. And with that, I'm actually going to hand over to Caroline.
Hello, my name is Caroline Haas. I head up sustainable finance for the FIs and SSAs. I've been at NatWest for about 18 months, and I have to say it's been a very, very exciting journey as we've seen a explosion of sustainable finance, or ESG, green and social bonds. So it's been a really, really interesting time to be here and be in this sector. I think I'm going to start off very much sort of answering the question, is there a paradigm shift from shareholders to stakeholders? And I think we get asked this very often. Is this actually meant to be? Or is this a short-term fad that's come across the market? And, you know, I have to say that I actually do believe that this is now here to stay. I think for a multitude of reasons, we have shifted too far the one direction with regard to stakeholder or shareholders and looking purely at financial gains. And unfortunately, COVID has only brought this to the forefront ever so more. The market is analyzing itself, is thinking about how to look at an investment. Companies are looking at how better to actually do their business. And so what you'll see is a very strong focus on purpose. And NatWest Group is definitely one of those organizations. In the leadership and stewardship of Alison Rose, the CEO, we have structured our business on 3 pillars: enterprise, learning, and climate. Now, as we proceed, you will see, does this actually make sense? Is there actually financial reasons to do this? And I think this is another place where COVID has shown this. And as we think about this, it involves, how do we engage with our customers? Is it a short-term perspective or a long-term perspective? How do we determine the next product, the segment that we would like to move into? What role do we actually play in society? And then, as I've talked about, how does this actually impact the financial performance? Now, in many ways, people see ESG as a sort of new fad, but there are investors out there who've been doing this for 15 years, and they hand on heart will say that there's actually financial gains to be had. And I think I'll take it back to the very basics. If you treat your customer well, the customer will continue to be your customer. If you don't treat a customer well, they will find another provider. Similarly, with regard to your employees, if you take the wellness of your employees at heart, they will continue to be loyal and serve the company. Similarly, it's how management then embodies this. And so one of the things that we're seeing more frequently now is some of these sort of purpose-driven targets directly linked to the remuneration. They're actually saying that this is important, and we are willing to take haircuts with regard to financial pay if these targets and ambitions are not attained. Now, we very much are now focusing on the internal stakeholders. But there are also the external stakeholders where, you know, the obvious one that I'd addressed previously is the customer. But nevertheless, supply chains are also really important. And if we can pass on that philosophy through the supply chains, we have a knock-on effect that really has a much greater impact beyond our own business. Now, undoubtedly, there will be skeptics. Undoubtedly, we still have a long way to go to convince everybody that there is actually sound reasoning behind this, and it's not just charitable. And, I've shown in the bottom two charts why, particularly over the last sort of 11 months, this has sort of landed. As you will see on the left-hand side, there is a graph of the performance of two indices. One is a green bond indices by government related entities, and the second is its conventional peer. Interestingly, if you look over the last 11 months, the green has outperformed by 27%. That is substantial given the incredibly low interest rate environment that we have and the tight spreads. On the right-hand side, you will see the in and out flows of ESG and conventional funds, both active as well as passive. It is really interesting to note that in March and April, when COVID was raging and there were lockdowns throughout Europe, how the conventional funds had significant outflows, whereas the ESG funds, irregardless if passive or active, experienced much lower outflows. And if you then take your eye to sort of September, October, it's also interesting that you see the ESG funds have a continued outperformance of increased inflows versus their conventional peers, which actually is very much in line also with the way asset owners are right now thinking. COVID has been tough on everyone. And when you now look, where are you going to invest your money? Actually, there's something comforting to think about when it is a more purpose-focused organization or fund versus someone who isn't really paying this much attention. Next slide, please. Now, as we talk about this, how is ESG actually being integrated? And how is it impacting an issuer's profile and strategy? At this point, it is actually also very important to note that about $103 trillion have now signed up to the UN PRI, which are the Principles for Responsible Investing. Now, one of the principles is actually to engage in ESG. It starts out with initial exclusion, then you move to ESG integration, which is definitely now the norm for the large global asset managers. And as you go through your journey, some of the investors are actually looking at impact and very much embracing impact investing to use their financial power to have change. Now, part of this involves active issuer engagement. And you won't be surprised to hear that a lot of this is not financial data. It is reporting on a non-financial, often qualitative basis, which really requires digging deeper and having those active conversations with an issuer. Now, the first thing that these investors tend to look at is an issuer's sustainability strategy. And part of the engagement is actually trying to understand, is the issuer actually walking the talk? Or are they just producing it nicely on slides or in glossy brochures or beautiful videos on their website? Or is actually the executive, management, and the rest of the employees really on board with the purpose-driven strategy? That requires accountability. And that comes back to my earlier point on remuneration. There's nothing better than tying accountability to financial payouts. One of the ways to exercise your sustainability strategy is obviously issuing a green or a social bond. And it is really important to note that the times have passed where you could use a green or social bond with very sort of green or social ambitions, but actually the underlying strategy of the issuer did not support that issue. This now comes part and parcel. The bond supports the strategy and not the other way around. Part of this now, obviously, looks towards reporting. And reporting has become incredibly important, incredibly challenging, but also something that everyone is working towards and trying to find a more homogeneous approach to sustainability. There are a number of organizations and platforms that are being set up. There are consultation papers. And I know my colleague Varun will go into that in greater detail. But it is very, very important so that actually we can compare issuers, companies, organizations across the board. Now, a new participant in this market is the ESG rating agency. There are, I think, roughly 150 of them. The most well-known are the likes of MSCI, Sustainalytics, and ISS ESG. Now, they do play an important role. I don't think in many ways it's particularly the rating, but it's the fact that they are aggregating all the information that is available publicly about an issuer in their systems. And so the investors are using them pretty well as data collectors. And, when I previously talked about the sort of large global asset managers, they are all in the process of creating their own ESG scorecards, methodologies, where these respective information feeds in. They then weight it accordingly as they see is important to their own strategy and purpose. Sometimes there's more focus on the environment, sometimes there's more focus on the social issues. Undoubtedly, governance is always one of those that plays a significant role, because if you don't have the governance and the structures in place to actually push this through the system, it's really, really difficult to monitor. And so this is how they will then use all that information and will then incorporate that into their own investment decision. And so I think it is important to note that now the term ESG leader and laggards is becoming quite common practice. So investors are actually ranking issuers in the same industry with regard to their own scores and then taking investment decisions. Some are very happy to play with the trajectory where they will go with someone who has a lower ESG rating, but they very strongly believe in the management and the underlying strategy that is being proposed, that over 2 or 3 years, this company or organization will change over time and have a positive ESG uplift. And this brings me back to these, KPIs across the 3 pillars: E for environment, S for social, and G for governance. And we are going to see numerous products coming out of with KPIs, but it's also very much sort of coming back to the initial point on accountability. And, is an organization ready to put a hard KPI or key performance indicator in the public domain that they aim to achieve? And it could be across any of those 3 pillars. And I think it's important to note that these do have to be ambitious, and that's very much what the market is looking for, and actually comes back to the shareholders and stakeholders, because obviously now the stakeholder is also really important, and that is the employees, future employees of the company, who will be looking at KPIs that have been set by a company to see if it was really meant and that the management is really working towards achieving those respective KPIs. So I hope that gives you a little bit of an idea of the interlinkages. It's still a long road, but it is an exciting one. And, we very much look forward to working with you on this journey. So on that note, let me pass you on to Varun. Thank you.
Thanks, Caroline. So in the last 2 decades, we've seen that sustainability has moved up the agenda among a broad range of different clients. And I think in particular, I think what's worth noting is it's really moved from being an extraordinary practice and usually very voluntary to becoming an expected practice. And I think the ask of companies increasingly in their disclosures is to begin to talk about how they're managing, but also measuring their performance. So companies are really having to think about how are they quantifying their environmental and social impacts, and how are they actually showing progress against managing them. If we just move on to the next slide. So I suppose what that's done is it's given rise to a broad range of different ESG or sustainability reporting frameworks, standards, and benchmarks. And I think what you see on this slide are some of the well-known ones. There are a broad range of different frameworks, and I think what's worth noting here is that they're each very different. They've started out from very different places in the corporate reporting landscape. The Global Reporting Initiative, for example, is very much an outward-facing framework, which is really trying to help companies to understand how they articulate the impact they're having on the environment and society. The Sustainability Accounting Standards Board is very much an inward-looking framework, which talks about how are some of the external influences around E, S, and G issues having an impact on the company itself and some of its broader value creation through its business activities. And then of late, we've seen a lot of discussion around the International Integrated Reporting Framework, where companies are beginning to think about moving from a standalone sustainability report towards trying to integrate it within their annual financial statements. So what that's meant is that companies have increasingly had to reconcile the requirements of these different frameworks. And I suppose to make things more exciting, there are also a number of other initiatives and developments out there, one of which is called the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. That's very much calling for enhanced disclosures around climate change. So especially in the areas of governance, strategy, risk management, and targets and metrics. So how a company is actually managing the implications of climate change for their business activities. And then there's the Sustainable Development Goals, which is very much a UN-led initiative, which is to try and encourage companies to think about the broader impact that their activities have on society and more broadly, and also how some of their activities link to some of these SDG goals. So examples of SDG goals here being poverty alleviation, gender equality, climate action or climate change. And so I suppose what that means is that companies are also having to grapple with these frameworks and reconcile it as part of their overall reporting story. There is light at the end of the tunnel, and I think what we've begun to see over the last 12 months is some consolidation. So a number of the reporting frameworks here, the GRI, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, as well as the International Integrated Reporting Framework, have come together to actually begin to try and come up with a consistent standard. And this has been a process in the making for a number of years, but I think in the last 12 months, we've actually seen a lot more noise around how they're beginning to try and reconcile their different frameworks. And I think the most exciting development here is the GRI and SASB have recently announced a joint collaboration to try and provide more clarity to the market on how their frameworks sit together and to really help companies report a bit more effectively. And the other development is at the World Economic Forum, there was a lot of discussion where the big four accounting firms came up with a list of KPIs or ESG metrics that all companies, irrespective of their sector, should be reporting on at the minimum. So if we just move on to the next slide. So I suppose what you're probably thinking of is, well, what are the components of creating a good sustainability disclosure or a good narrative around a company's sustainability performance? And I'd say there are probably 5 steps here. The first is very much making sure you have a strong tone from the top. It's very important that this agenda has the support from the most senior people in the organization. And typically a lot of reports will have a foreword from the CEO or the chairman of the company. It's also very important to reflect on the operating environment that company is facing. So different companies, obviously based on their geographical location and their sector, will face very different ESG issues. And so it's important to reflect on that and what that means for the company. And I suppose that also then means that companies have to articulate what do they see as some of the larger risks and opportunities, and what that means for their own, performance and longer-term value creation. The next step is really making sure that the reporting that you're producing is reflective of a broad range of stakeholders' information needs. The companies of today really need to start thinking about not just investors, but there are a broad range of other interested and affected parties who are very interested in their ESG disclosures. And I'm talking about customers here, I'm talking about suppliers, I'm talking about civil society and NGOs. And increasingly lenders as well. So it's very important that companies are clear about what are the different information needs and requirements of their key stakeholders, and importantly, try and engage with them on what they deem to be those matters that particularly require enhanced reporting. And I think this is where some of the different frameworks also come in. Lots of companies have tended to report and run stakeholder engagement panels where they socialize some of their early drafts of the reporting so that their stakeholders have an opinion or have an opportunity to actually opine on what they're reporting and really help to refine it. But many others are looking to establish standards and reporting frameworks, like I mentioned on the previous slide. And those are informed by extensive stakeholder consultation and engagement, ranging from investors through to civil society, academia, and others. The third step is really articulating your sustainability strategy. So as I mentioned, every company will have different issues based on its physical locations, but also in terms of its sectors. And it's very important that a company thinks about which are those issues that are really relevant to it. But also, what are the issues that are of increasing stakeholder interest and commercial impact? Most sustainability reporting companies, or most companies that engage in sustainability reporting, will generally tend to have something called a materiality matrix, which is essentially a 2x2 grid that basically talks about those issues that are of growing stakeholder interest and those that are of growing commercial impact. And so typically the topics that are in the top right-hand quadrant of that matrix, which are high stakeholder interest and high commercial impact, are the ones to absolutely start your reporting journey on, because they're going to be the ones of most interest. And then, of course, trying to pull that together and link it to how that stacks up to some of the established standards and initiatives. I was talking about the UN Sustainable Development Goals earlier, the TCFD requirements is very important. A lot of sustainability reports will have an appendix at the end, or rather an index, where they basically tend to give the reader a good sense of which of these different criteria they've ticked in the reporting standards, which also helps some of the ESG ratings analysts and broader readership to understand what are the areas that they have covered within the body of the report. Lastly, or I guess penultimately, then there's a huge focus on what are the actual issues that you need to report on. And I think what you see here are some of the breadth of environmental, social, and governance issues. It's fair to say that each of these issues will have an underlying policy behind it, procedures, a lot of capacity building, a lot of data and controls. So definitely think of this not just as being a sustainability team or a marketing and comms effort, but very much a joined up effort internally with the rest of the business so that you have the right proof points and the right data points to talk about in your report. And finally, I guess, because there is a lot of information out there, a lot of readers of sustainability reporting are beginning to look for external verification and or some sort of independent third-party assessment to show that the information is robust, that's being presented, and importantly, reliable. If we just move on to the next slide, then what you see here is really a good example of what this looks like in practice. So we've drawn on Kingfisher as an example of a company that we think is reporting well. And what you see in the top left-hand quadrant is a materiality matrix, as I was referring to earlier. You'll see there are a broad range of issues, and it's not to say that there are issues that are not just on this matrix. I mean, like there are a broad range of other issues as well, right, that will be relevant to the company. But the purpose of the materiality matrix is to really highlight those ones that are of higher priority, and then to lead in your broader report based on those topics and to really articulate what is your story around them. And so what you see here on the block on the bottom left-hand side is the company's articulation of some of the big issues around ESG for them and what their approach is, and also what are some of the metrics that they're using to measure their performance on them. And then on the right-hand side, you can see an example of what an assurance statement looks like from a non-financial perspective. And this is typically found within the body of the sustainability report. So I think that probably brings me to the end of my presentation. I'm very happy to take questions, but for the meanwhile, I'll just hand over back to Dom.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. And thank you for everybody joining. The first question, and I suppose this that's come in, I suppose for Caroline first, and maybe Varun can answer as well, is who in my organisation should join an ESG working group?
That's a really good question, actually. I almost think from every function as one starts to actually lay the methodology. Interestingly enough, we're just putting something together similarly within NatWest Markets, because ESG, if you look at it, touches in so many different areas. So I would definitely say somebody from the treasury function, somebody from reporting, legal, communications / marketing, and also from operations, because some of this obviously requires IT amendments and you need to tag things. And then the other element, which we don't talk about as much, but is vital in this as well, is risk, bringing that in as well. So yeah, forgive me if I've given you sort of the full menu of people to bring in, but I think at this point, bringing more in is beneficial, and it actually brings everybody on board at the same time.
Thanks, Caroline. And Varun, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I was just saying I would absolutely echo what Caroline said. And I think whilst it does sound like a very broad group of stakeholders, as I was saying earlier, it's very important to get the whole organization behind this, because it's not simply one individual team that does this. And I think in addition to risk, I would also say there's strategy to think about. There's a big opportunity, and I think it's quite fitting with the title of this session. It's really about companies taking control of their sustainability narrative, rather than being assessed based on their current level of disclosures and being perceived to not be doing enough. So definitely think about it also as an opportunity for your strategy team to come in and really help to create or to inform your purpose-led reporting, and really helping you to articulate a better story in your short, medium, and longer term.
Thanks, Varun. There's probably a question now for Caroline. It's we've seen a number of investors cite increased appetite for ESG, and per the charts in the presentation, the indices, is there an outperformance with regards to ESG labeled debt?
Yes. So ESG labeled debt, I think if I look back in January to now, January, I would tend to do a little bit of a dance and say, is there actually spread performance? And would you actually have a financing benefit if you did a green or a social bond? We would see somewhere between maybe 1 to 5 basis points. Partially given COVID, partially given the enhanced issuance and volumes, the support that's come through from the EU with regard to their recent announcement for 100 billion of social bonds that will be coming to the market in the next 18 months. Just to give you that idea. So I think there's a whole range of reasons, but also the fact that there's just so many more investors now chasing green and social assets for their portfolios. We are realizing significant oversubscription rates in the transactions that we're doing. And it will be anywhere from the order of 3 to 7 to 8 times. The EU SURE bond, you won't believe it, was between 12 and 14 times oversubscribed. And so as a result, that gives you obviously a lot more price tension in the book building process. And prior to allocations, it enables the syndicates to actually torque the spread much more. Now, what I would say on that note is the more sort of the higher rated issuers will be, particularly the AAA SSAs or covered bonds, are able to take less of that pricing benefit out of the market, partially because of the low interest rate environment and also already negative spreads. As you move up through either the capital stack or through to lower rated issuers, there's actually a much greater gain of using green and social bonds. And that will be anywhere in the order from 15 to 40 basis points. I think it was Volkswagen who recently said that they've got an annual cost saving of about £3 million of interest rate charges because of the green bond. So there is definitely now benefits from doing this type of issue.
Thanks very much, Caroline. There's a question here on around reporting and the impact reporting. So regarding building the sustainability narrative, one area that people are conscious of is impact reporting and ongoing obligations. What are investors' expectations when it comes to reporting? And how can people ensure that that they are in effect following best in class? Varun, do you want to take that?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, very happy to start off. So I think when companies think about reporting and impact reporting, I think it's very natural for them to think about what I call output measures. So how many people have you reached? What has been the amount you've invested in a particular environmental initiative? How much have you saved in terms of your carbon emissions or reduced? But the bigger question really, and one that goes to the heart of impact reporting, is so what? And so outcome reporting, basically like those output metrics need to move towards becoming outcome type of measures as well. So if a company is reporting the number of people it's reached from financial capability perspective, and I speak about this because I know that NatWest is thinking about this, the bigger question we're really trying to address is what impact have our programs around money sense and more broadly around financial learning actually made in helping improve financial awareness and capability more broadly in the UK and in the Ireland, which is where we really primarily focus. So I think I'd really encourage people to try and make that distinction that just because you report on output metrics, it's not going to be the end. It's worth start thinking about outcome metrics as well, because that's really where impact reporting will go.
Thanks very much. Another question here. Please, can you walk through the common pitfalls regarding building out sustainability narrative? Caroline, I don't know if you want to take that first, and then maybe Varun can add anything.
I think ultimately, the narrative comes from the organization and the management itself. Really, that's where you have to start. You have to look at what is the purpose of the organization, and really the reporting tends to highlight that. And you really kind of have to sit down and say, what is the role that one as an organization wants to play with regard to the broad reach of its stakeholders? And, I think I was recently on a webinar where I was listening to the ex-CEO of Unilever, and he was saying, it has to start somewhere, and then you really need to ensure that everyone within the organization also gets on board and really believes that narrative. It's not just something that you're talking, it's actually coming from the inner core of the organization. And that then tends to filter out throughout. And you then pillar it, and you create it through either engagement with your customers, product development, financial performance, and that then comes together. But I do think first port of call is what one as an organization actually wants to champion and really support. So Varun, if I can maybe pass it on to you.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline, and absolutely agree with that. I think one of the challenges I see with many clients, but also having done a lot of reporting for NatWest Group previously, is it's very important to think about where your reporting is going and where you want it to go in 3 to 5 years' time, and that requires a bit of planning, but also working internally with a broad range of different people. And I think one of the things that's really required there is, right now, there's so many different reporting pressures and frameworks that companies can sometimes fall foul, unintentionally, of trying to make reporting move faster than the level of integration that's actually happening behind. And so I would say always, as you're doing your sustainability narrative and reporting, always make sure it's very much a reflection of the actual level of progress at the time of reporting, because otherwise it can paint quite a different picture. And the other thing I would say is really around measurement and controls. Lots of companies are beginning to think about metrics, but if we look at this more broadly, it's very important to make sure those metrics are relevant and they're saying something more broadly in terms of the company's strategy and where it has a key opportunity to really influence change. So, what I'm really talking about here is I think it's important that the metrics are the right ones for the company and they align well with the company's strategy, but also they're backed up with sufficient evidence and the right controls, And so as you think about reporting this, think about the basis of reporting. What is the source data that's been used? What's the scope of the data that's been used to pull together that metric? Because that's absolutely the type of stuff that external assurance and independent verification will involve. And by thinking about these things right from the beginning, you only make your lives easier when it comes to external assurance and, frankly, even conversations about what your next steps are to evolve your reporting.
Thanks, Varun. I suppose just on that, and this is slightly related, I think the question is more the angle of, given the differing ESG reporting frameworks and standards available, how does a company choose the right one? And do investors have a preference for a specific framework? I think where that question's coming from is either project related or more specifically at a corporate level in terms of the actual framework. So I don't know, Caroline, perhaps you can talk to that first, and then maybe Varun, you can add anything that you think is useful.
So it's definitely a minefield. I would say there are a lot of different reporting standards, and it definitely doesn't make it easier. What I would say, though, is over the last sort of 8-9 months, there is a concerted effort to try to align these different standards and bring it together. And so hopefully, I would say over the next 18 months, we will have a clear guide of which of the options are the more viable ones or the ones that actually have longevity. Now, when you ask about the investor side, I think they're also, trying to grapple with this, because even if they have a certain preference, it doesn't necessarily mean that the issuers are using that. And so they actually have to be quite nimble across all the different reporting standards to then kind of create comparability between issuers. So the fact when we talk about non-financial reporting, you really realize how complex it is. And you often now look at a balance sheet, you think, isn't this easy just to have some numbers and they're all comparable. So we're definitely going through that gap moment right now with regard to sustainability, and we'll, have more granularity over time. So bear with it. I think it's always one of those, to start is already the first step, because ultimately it's the data collection. And, it may look a little different, but actually getting the data in itself is already the first step onto that journey. So Varun, if I could pass that on.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. Again, completely echo that. And I think helpfully for us in the last couple of months, as Caroline was saying, we have seen a lot more effort to try and consolidate these different frameworks. But there are two particular things I would call out here. One is, depending on where you are in your reporting journey, sometimes the Global Reporting Initiative can be a very good starting point, because it's very much intended to help companies to begin to articulate what is their impact on environment and society. But if you're a more mature organization that has been reporting on ESG issues, then I would really encourage you to start thinking about integrated reporting, which is where you really begin to encompass and embed your ESG reporting within your broader strategy and your financial reporting. So there is some sense, depending on your level of maturity in ESG reporting, some of the frameworks can be quite useful and apt. I think the other thing I would say is, in terms of metrics, that remains a fundamental challenge. And I would say the World Economic Forum basically worked together with the big four accounting firms. And one of the things that's really come out of that, which is really positive, is They are now a list of ESG metrics or KPIs that all companies, irrespective of their sector, should be reporting at a minimum. And I'd really encourage companies to have a look at that, and very happy to help with that as well. So yeah, that's me.
Thanks, Varun. I think we've probably got time for one more, and I suppose it's following on from that in terms of navigating the minefields. Someone's asked, how can NatWest support me in crafting my sustainability narrative? So Varun, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, thanks. Just gonna unmute myself. So yeah, I think just building on that, I mean, what we do here at NatWest Advisory is we tend to support clients across the spectrum. So I think of it as two main buckets. One is strategic ESG support and advisory, and the other is the financing piece of it, where we work very closely with a number of our colleagues across the franchise. With regards to strategic advisory, it's very much helping companies to understand what are their material issues, what are the right frameworks they should be looking at, given what's been mentioned earlier today, what are the right rating agencies, which ones are of particular interest to their target investor base, but also their broader stakeholders. We help with a lot of that analysis, and we also help to really offer some guidance around what does a good functioning ESG working group look like on the company side? What are the terms of reference that they should be thinking about, just to make sure that they're organized and structured in the right way? What are the right metrics that they should be thinking about? What are the right ones to start off with? Because obviously there are a breadth of ESG issues that will be relevant. But if you recall what I said earlier, it's important to start off with those that are most material and that are commercially relevant and that are of high stakeholder interest. So we help across that piece. But I think most importantly, we're a very good sounding board, and we can help with that. We can help answer questions. We can help with capacity building, and really help with articulating your ESG story, so that it allows you to be in a position where you can tell the story the way you want, rather than be perceived by a rating agency or a third party in an inaccurate way or an unfair way.
Thanks, Varun. And Caroline, I don't know if you want to add something on the financing side in terms of support.
Yes, in many ways, it is actually interconnected. And I think that's really important, is that, there were times where you could do, for example, a green bond, but you had a really brown strategy. Now these things come part and parcel. I think very much the sustainability strategy of the organization is then underpinned by a green or a social bond. And that's really the way the investors also look at it. Obviously the credit fundamentals are still the credit fundamentals. Then they tend to look at the ESG profile of an issuer. And then really the next level is then looking at the framework or the green or social bond. But there is that direct linkage. And if you look at any framework right from the start, the first, page and a half or 2 pages actually talks about the sustainability strategy of the organization. And that's why, it's also the way the investors look at you initially, because quite honestly, there aren't sufficient green and social bonds to meet the demand. There continues to be this supply-demand imbalance. And so really what the investors are doing is bringing that together, is looking at the ESG profile of the institution. And that's how that feeds all back into the reporting, the disclosure, everything that you're doing in the system, and that linkage. So, we're very, very astute or attuned to that, and also ensure then whatever kind of materials that you're producing that go to the market during a financing actually really tries to highlight your strategy and bring the 2 points together. So that's what I would say. Thank you.
Fantastic. I don't believe we've got any more questions, so it just leaves me to thank Caroline and Varun for their presentations, and thank you for joining us today.